Good afternoon, everyone. Guten Tag. I want to thank Claudia for that interesting introduction. And I must also thank Professor Pierre. I must thank Jan for the solidarity and also for consistently reaching out. It's a pleasure. And I thank everyone for also joining us for this section. I've been told that sometimes it doesn't get fuller like this. So I'm honored, I'm much honored by your presence. My name is Temitope Fagunwa. I am an African historian. I currently happen to be an historian that specializes in African diasporic histories. And I've been following this trend, I think ever since I decided to pick up my PhD. I decided to research on Afro-Brazilians in Lagos, because in colonial Lagos, you have a thriving Afro-Brazilian community that has been in existence since the mid-19th century. And then that became a basis for me to be interested, not just in, the African diasporic communities also, within the African continent, but beyond the African continent. So just last year, I decided to apply early last year, or late to last year's, I decided to apply for a postdoc fellowship at Lüneburg, which was then accepted. And I then decided to, join the, Institute to research on African diasporic histories also, within the context of the African Moors in Moorish Spain from the 8th century to the 13th century. But today, we're not going to be discussing the African Moors. The topic we have in front of us is residual histories and the medieval formation of Black representation in European pharmacy. Well, I think it is important to state that my research, in a way, is I'm honored by this research in itself, in the sense that I've come to realize that, in a way, it intersects with some of the work, some of the philosophy, some of the understanding of the man in which we are honoring today, who is the person of late Professor Joseph Miller. I think when you examine his work, you will come down to a logical conclusion that perhaps you represent for us one of the most interesting, Africanist scholars of the 20th century, because we are talking about a scholar that decided to change the narrative around the Atlantic slavery. And beyond that, he also went on his way, he went out of his way to also introduce, one of the areas that we historians, we are taught not to pay attention to, which is the importance of oral sources. We have been told that, oral sources is not one of the ways that which you could, that it is inferior, it is anachronistic. But no. He treated, oral history in an interesting way for us. And I think that, in a way, stands him out. And why Professor Joseph Miller is also important for me, I think. And by the way, I came across his works as an undergraduate student. And when I came across his work, I was not as an undergraduate student, apologies, as a master's student, but I came across the work of a professor that, in a way, is also interesting to me within the context of the person of Joseph Miller. And I share this story to my students often. It's the person of late Professor Basil Davison, the British historian. And as an undergraduate student, I would read Basil Davison's work. I would, go through, and I always imagine that perhaps Basil Davison was a Caribbean historian, because of the way at which he writes about the African continent. He writes, you could see the passion, you could see, his attempt to clearly change the narrative. So I would always imagine him to be, a Caribbean. As an undergraduate student, as an undergraduate historian, I would always imagine him to be, a Caribbean historian. And you could imagine how shocking it was for me when I found out that he's actually a British historian. How shocking it was, because as an undergraduate, student, we get inspiration from, Africanist historians of the continent, the person of, Chekanta Diop and, Walter Rodney and all of these amazing guys that have attempted to decolonize, the discourse. So when I came across Basil Davison, not just a European historian, but a British historian. I was like, wow, interesting. So Joseph Miller, late Professor Joseph Miller would also be, one of those the second in the line of that tradition. Is one of the historians that I think happens to be a force to reckon with. I happen to be forced to reckon with within the context of changing the narrative. Ultimately, one of the things that I think it did, which in a way connects to some of the things I'm going to discuss today, is the question of the fact that regardless of what it is, regardless of the modus operandi of oppression, exploitation, we should also pay attention, to cases of agencies within the context of the oppressed. Sometimes we imagine the oppressed under whatever nomenclature as, subjugated elements, as subjugated subjects that cannot in any way, articulate their own understanding or in fact, come up with their own institutions and agencies. But, Professor Joseph Miller did that. He showed us that when he wrote about the Angolan slave trade, in a way, exposing the fact that beyond the European slave merchants, we also had African, on the continent in Angola in particular, who were also coming up with their own understanding of what the system should be about. So I think in a way, we must honor that fact. We must lay emphasis on how much he paid, that careful study on indigenous agencies, on indigenous institutions and structures, which for me, I think is very, very germane right now. So I'll be doing three important things today. I'll be ultimately what I'm interested in is to examine Black symbolism in European apothecary culture, and I'm pushing three major arguments. The first is that Mediterranean and also the Indian Ocean spice trade must be looked into in way of understanding this phenomenon. The transmission of pharmacological knowledge across linguistic traditions have also got to be studied. Lastly, courtly visual culture under Frederick II in Sicily has got to be studied. I think these three analyses, these three points, in a way, have the potentials to, to reveal to us those things we really do not know about this whole concept. And I've decided to balkanize the discussion into 6 parts. I'm going to look at the statement of research focus, conceptual framework, residual history, material foundation pharmacology, material foundation also spice trade, Black representation from court to apothecary, research hypothesis, and my conclusion. But before I begin, I would like to state that this presentation, I would like to state a content advisory. This presentation includes historical images and visual materials that contain racialized vocabularies and dehumanizing representations of Black figures. These materials are presented strictly for critical and scholarly analysis within historical context. Their inclusion does not reproduce or endorse the meanings they once carried, but instead seeks to examine how such imagery function within systems of representation, commerce, and knowledge in medieval and early modern Europe. Well, it is a fact that before 2018, you would get so many modern apothecars in Germany, and permit me if I use the word, I'm using it within the context of historical discourse, so my apologies. I am conscious of the fact that the word itself is today anachronistic within the context of Germany. Since 2018 or thereabout, the German government has decided to place a ban on its usage. But then, permit me, I'm using it within the context of historical study and historical analysis. Before 2018, you would get, it was fashionable for you to have, most pharmacies in Germany, over 100 of them, you would have representation called modern apothecary, and beyond that, you would have Black iconography, Black symbolism, as we have it on the screen. But usually, as it has been said and it has been argued successfully, which I believe rightly so, these iconographies are indeed racialized caricature, imageries of Black people, which in fact form the basis upon which you have this contest in 2018. Members of the Black German community, felt that this kind of displays cannot be used today in the 21st century to describe Black people, that it is anachronistic, it is not acceptable. And indeed, there were some gains because today you cannot have this imagery anywhere. Even when some of us think that 2018 should have come earlier, in a way. But then, I really don't think there's a time that it's too late for justice to take its stance. I think ultimately that despite these gains that have been recorded, two things I've been able to deduce from this whole, from this whole process, which is that yes, there's victory for positivity. Those imageries have been removed, and also you cannot have a pharmacy. Okay, there are about 3 pharmacies still left in Germany that bears the name myrrh apotheker. Actually, but then most pharmacies had jettisoned the name myrrh apotheker, the word myrrh apotheker. So indeed, victory for positivity for me has been won. But on the other side, because I'm an historian, and I'm also an historian that also believes in some of the teachings of Joseph Miller, I think that the victory for historical knowledge and understanding has not been won. And I mentioned Joseph Miller because, again, when you return to some of the works, some of the postulations of Joseph Miller, he said that our duty as historians, our duty ultimately as historians is to trace contextual phenomena within the context of history. That is to say that whatever phenomenon seems to be, debatable in the world at which we're living in today as historians, Joseph Miller proposed that we must disintegrate. We must, invite those phenomena within the context of history. That is to say that we must place them within the context of historical timeline, not just to, examine the phenomenon on the surface. That is to say that the concept of myrrh apotheker to us presents a phenomenon that needs a thorough historical treatment, a thorough historical treatment. And I wouldn't be saying this if indeed this thorough historical treatment has been done. Actually, I came to Lüneburg, as I said earlier on, to study the African Moors, the legacies, the cultural legacies of the African Moors in Moorish Spain, from the 8th century to the 13th century. But upon my arrival, I would realize that, in fact, the question of cultural legacy lies in Germany. The question of cultural legacy lies in Germany, but in a very, very less understandable way, which is the concept of, which is this whole thing around the pharmacy. So, yeah, again, positivity, but there's no room, or there hasn't been any room for historical knowledge and understanding as far as I'm concerned. To do this, because one of the things, again, that I think as an historian that has got to be done is that we cannot solve some of this contemporary discourse within the context of parochialism. That is to say that we must ensure that in our approach, in our understanding, in our analysis, we try to build a broader, all-encompassing analysis on these issues, not to solve them, not to look at them within the context of our own enclave. And one of the things that I found out is that for those that have attempted to treat this subject matter, they have failed to see, the broader analysis that are necessary. For German historians that have attempted to treat it, they treat it only within the context of Germany, forgetting the fact that this whole discussion around myrrh or myrrh apotheker goes beyond Germany. And as I have it here on the screen, you would see that you have the Germanic, the version of myrrh apotheker across Germanic regions. We are talking about Germany, we are talking about Austria, we are talking about Netherlands. And then in Italy, we also have versions of this myrrh apotheker. We have Pharmacie de Moro, Pharmacie de Mori, and others. And beyond these two regions, you also have the presence of this phenomenon in Central and Eastern Europe. Needless do I need to mention that you also have that in the Iberian region. The Iberian region, which includes Spain, is the first meeting point of the Berbers, of the Arabs in the 8th century. That's where they settled. They are coming into Europe in the 8th century. Their first contact with Europe in the 8th century, was Spain. So needless to mention that you also have this trend in this region. Well, I attempted to look at scholars that have, that have attempted to give an explanation to this. Again, this concept lies within the fact that, we've always had this, black symbolism, iconography, in these pharmacies. So some scholars have been able to, have attempted to provide us with analysis on why these, representations have always existed, why these representations have always existed. The first hypothesis that I'm raising is the work of Conrad, where he said in his own analysis, in his own submission, that this black iconography of representation in pharmacies in Germany are nothing but a product of a 16th century naming culture. They are nothing but a product of a, So Conrad said that the existence of these pharmacies, this iconography rather, this representation goes back to the 16th century German naming culture, that places began to be named, after individuals, after important people, after Alemas, after, this and that, or what have you. There is also another hypothesis. The second hypothesis I'm looking at, this has been inspired by the works of Eugen Monika. It has also been inspired by the work of Browning Peter, an important German historian that I admire his works. He said in one of his works that essentially what we talk about this black representation in the pharmacies, in German pharmacies, the concept of myrrh and apothecary emanated from, the three magi tradition, what we call the three wise men, tradition in the Christendom, that, at a point in time in medieval churches in Germany, a black figure was introduced, as one of the three magi. And that, astonishingly, this produced black personality in the person of Balthasar, while the two wise men brought different gifts to the baby Jesus Christ, Balthasar brought a medicinal plant known as myrrh, And I attempted to look at the origin of myrrh, and I found out that indeed, myrrh during the medieval period was heavily, cultivated in northeastern part of Africa, but beyond northeastern part of Africa, also in the Mediterranean. And indeed, when you look at important spices in the medieval period, you would agree with me that myrrh was one of those important spices during the medieval period. So therefore, Brownline was of that position that the introduction or the infusion of the person of Balthasar into the three magi, became the basis upon which, pharmacy owners began to represent black iconography, black imageries in their pharmacies as a basis of that explanation. And then you have it, one of the earliest 15th century painting of the three magi. And of course, you can see the black figure. And to me, it's quite interesting because the black figure has this facial resemblance with a facial resemblance of an Ethiopian, in actual fact. Also, buttressing the point being made against the backdrop of, the heavy cultivation of myrrh in that region. I proceed. The third hypothesis, because we must study relevant works, ongoing works on this subject matter, has been inspired by a conclusion by three important European scholars. Oh no, Paul Kaplan is not, he's based in US. These three amazing scholars, they have postulated, although Paul Kaplan did not deal with this subject matter directly, but one of the conclusions he reached in one of his important works, published in the 80s, is black representation in Italy. There's a way I cannot remember. But the conclusion that was reached by these scholars is that to discuss black representation in the pharmacies, it is germane for us to go back to medieval Sicily. particularly during the reign of Frederick II, that as a matter of fact, the proliferation of Black symbolism, the proliferation of Black imageries, the proliferation of Black semantics, across Europe, beginning from the medieval period, was consequent, to the activities of this important king known as Frederick II. That Frederick II rose to power on the back of the relationship he was able to build with the Muslims, the Arabs, the Jews, the Africans, the Blacks, in Sicily. And that he was able to do so also because he imagined himself as an imperial king, that is the king over other kings. He had this nickname, Stupomundu, that is, I'm the ruler of the world or something like that. So these important scholars, Jean Davis, Jeff Kaplan, they are of the position that the consistent production of Black imageries in the court of Frederick in the 13th century became the basis for the emergence of what we would call the myrrh, the production of myrrh cups and what have you. And as a matter of fact, Kaplan has said that what you have here, which is the image of Saint Maurice, this is the image of Saint Maurice, the first, I think, description of Saint Maurice in the 13th century. And I visited the Magdeburg Cathedral to see this for myself. And it's still standing as strong as it was, then. So Professor Kaplan is of the position that this whole idea about the production of Black imageries, Black symbolism in the pharmacies, began with the production of this, Saint Maurice sculpture in Magdeburg in the 13th century. Yeah, in the 13th century. That it began as a result of that. Following the production of this symbolism, persons, food lords, important persons, farm traders, bishops began to incorporate, these imageries into their different activities. But I have my own argument. My argument is that essentially something has been ignored. And what has been ignored again is the question of historical grounding. That despite the prevailing attempt by these scholars to look at this discourse, to establish this, within that, and all of that, that the question of appropriate historical grounding, and what do I mean by appropriate historical grounding? We must draw inspiration again from Joseph Miller, because one of the things he said is that we must study historical processes within the context of their changing dynamics. That you cannot entirely say that this formation belongs to this narrative essentially. That there must be a way at which we must look at how events, how narratives intersect. Ultimately, through intersection, that we can have a better clarity as to what is what, as to whatever became what it is today. That if we do not look at those changes, those changing processes, we wouldn't have the fuller clarity. And to push on with my argument, I'm proposing, the concept of residual history. That what has been ignored ultimately is a product of residual history. Nothing else but the product of residual history. And I attempted to come up with this. It's a chart of mine, and it's open to criticism. That's all right. So, to attempt a conceptual framework, I am suing Eurocentrism as a propellant of residual history. And essentially, what do I mean by residual history? Residual history is an accumulation of fictions that obscures reality, that obscures clarity, in the sense that when you refuse to unearthing, non-European or or indigenous people's histories, when you, place more interest over and above, a particular history over and above others, we tend to not have a clarity as to how the history of the world in itself, intersects. So I'm saying that one of the things that we have, one of the legacies that we are dealing with today as members of the human world, consequent to the dominance of Eurocentrism at a point in time, is number one, the superiority of European historicity, and that essentially the superiority of European historicity pushes an agenda that, European achievement has got to be universal, and beyond being universal again, that that other histories, must be treated with levity. That is what I mean by suppression of non-European histories, marginalization. And what comes out of that ultimately? The marginalization of indigenous knowledge, distortion of non-European narratives, and what have you. Essentially, two things again comes out from this: silence knowledge. And, some of the consequences of silence knowledge is that the tendencies of we not having clarity or awareness of diverse histories. And I think ultimately the world at which we're living in today requires us to internalize, the importance of diversity, so that we really do not see the world within a particular spectacle. I think ultimately for us to begin to move forward as human beings, we must begin to aspire to see how we come together, how we connect, and the field of history has the prerequisites to bring this, intersectionality. So from silence knowledge, you would have lack of awareness of diverse histories, lack of awareness of the historical interconnectedness of the world. Residual histories of non-Europeans also becomes the basis as a result of this process. Yeah, and ultimately what holds this phenomenon together is what I have it here as Eurocentric scholarship. The museums, the educational system, sometimes the organization, sometimes that refuses to look at other histories, that refuses to look at other roles, in the making of the world at which we're living in today. And I need to say that, in fact, we're seeing the continuation of this phenomenon till date, which to some of us is, is in a way, a product of indifference in a way, because again, some of us refuse to understand that knowledge is not independent. Often we imagine knowledge or the university environment to be independent from social power, from the power base. But for some of us, we really do not think that knowledge in itself is independent from the control of power. Power more often than not determines the direction of knowledge, which is why for some of us, we think it was not acceptable, for instance, for the 27 European nations to push back when there was a call recently by UN, for the description of the Atlantic slavery to be the gravest crime in the human history. And to some persons, they think we are having a binary discussion within this context when we say that the Atlantic slavery was indeed the greatest crime against humanity. It's not the question of binary, and I think for me that it is not also accidental that you have, the entirety of the members of EU backing out from this, phenomenon. It is a product of, yet again, what I think is the importance of this kind of research, because what has consistently been pushed, the narrative that has consistently been pushed, unfortunately, in some quarters, is that there was nothing like Africa-Europe relationship before the Atlantic slavery. That in fact, the 15th century marked the commencement of black-white relationship in the world, which is nothing but a fallacy, but that position has got to be sustained. That position has got to be institutionalized clearly, because there's a necessity to deem our understanding of what was before the 15th century, what the relationship was, before the 16th century, how we connect with each other before the 15th century, because that knowledge in itself, has a way of demystifying a lot, has a way of demystifying how we treat ourselves politically, socioculturally, and what have you, in fact, today. So my argument, essentially, consequent to the propellant of residual history caused by Eurocentrism, is the continuous methodolization of non-European histories. So it is okay for me, I think that despite the fact that we have these traces of Black presence in Europe before the 15th century. In some quarters, scholars are still treating this phenomenon as a mythical phenomenon, and that it is a myth. And if at all it existed, it was accidental. And I take you back to the conclusion of these three amazing scholars. The position is that the presence of Black people ultimately in Sicily was nothing but a product of a symbolism of cosmopolitanism. It's a symbolism of cosmopolitanism in the court of Frederick. That statement is powerful. That statement is instructive, because what that statement does is that it blinds us, of the agency of people that were actually in that society. Because what this means, in other words, is that the presence was mythical. That Frederick, cooked up these iconographies in order to uplift, elevate his own status, forgetting the fact that Frederick wouldn't have done so if indeed, there weren't Black persons in that society, or if there weren't Arabs in that society, if there weren't persons that he appreciates indeed in that society. So I'm saying that the continuous treatment of these earliest encounters as accidental, as mythical, are not serving good purposes. It's similar, sometimes So now we go straight into the discourse. And material foundation pharmacology. Now, what has happened is that consequent to the continuous mythologization, treatment of, past histories as mere myths. Today in Europe, as Richard Fletcher had said, and I'm not the one, Richard Fletcher, he has said that the creative role of Islamic Spain in the shaping of European intellectual culture is still not widely enough appreciated. I repeat, Richard Fletcher, in his work, an interesting work, I must say, published in 2006, the creative role of Islamic Spain in the shaping of European intellectual culture is still not widely appreciated. Therefore, what comes out of this is that the cross-cultural knowledge transmission, the interrelationship that the world has been reckoning under, or has been operating under, before the commencement of the 15th century is less known. It's less known. But then, for us as historians, we must continue to push this narrative, because we believe ultimately that these narratives, have the tendency of binding us together as members of the single human community. Key processes to this narrative: the material foundation of pharmacology, as a way of establishing that the emergence of Black representation in pharmacies, as iconographies, as in signages, in semantics, are not accidental. They are grounded in historical reality of the medieval period. Posting translation and revision movement. Scholars have examined Moorish Spain, scholars have examined Sicily, and they have come down to a conclusion that from the 11th to the 13th centuries, you have interesting, spread, proliferation of medical knowledge, in Spain and also in Sicily. As a matter of fact, today, when we imagine the pharmacy, we imagine the pharmacy as a conventional place where we go to, smelling of chemical, here and that. But earliest pharmacies, medieval pharmacies, smells of plants, the smell of plants. The history of the pharmacy we know today began with the history of herbs in actual fact. So during this period from the 11th to the 13th century, what then happened is that you have Arab scholars, interesting Arab scholars, African scholars, who were committed into the translation of, Greek writings, earliest Greek writings into Latin. Because what happened is that when Rome fell, let us don't forget that Rome fell in the 5th century. When Rome fell, of course, you have disintegration. You had, you have the necessity for the translation of works, for the translation of writings, for the translation of, for the projection, continued projection of quote and unquote the advancement in that society. So consequent to that collapse, the Arabs will step in. So those knowledge that were not, that had gone with the collapse, with the decline of Rome, would be brought back into Europe as a result of the activities of these interesting, translators, beginning from the 11th century. And what then happened from this? You can see the key works. For instance, one of the most interesting works, one of the most medical works during the medieval period is Materia Medical, where you have list of drugs, list of plants, and beyond that, you also have the question of how you use it, information around how drugs are being used during this period. In a way, these works, these earliest, translated medical writings, would become the basis for the emergence of modern pharmacy as understood today. Let us don't forget that, as a matter of fact, the birth of European first medical school can actually be dated to Sicily. That is the Schola Medical Salaterenia. And Salaterenia became famous consequent to the translation of Constant the Africanus, the prominent, North African translator. He spent a great chunk of his life translating, Greek writings into Latin, therefore making it accessible to persons in Europe to become the basis of, development and advancement. And you could see it, the Arabic drug names, Campbell, saffron, tarak, myrrh, many of these drugs were actually introduced into Europe during this period. And there you have it. This is from the Materia Medical, and it is a discussion of Baghdad scholars discussing medical care during the 7th century. And one thing is very, very important. One thing to me seems to be fascinating about this is the fact that you also have a black figure here. You also have a black figure in the middle, this discussion, which shows the fact that for whatever we describe as Islamic medicine of the medieval period, we must also give credit, to the black persons, individuals that were involved also in this creation. And that's why Constantine the African also stands out to some of us. Although in public discussion he's been depicted as an Arab, but that's quite understandable. It's one of the struggles that we're trying to decolonize, or we're trying to, expose in itself for its distortion. So we asked the question, why Sicily? Why Sicily? Well, Sicily was and I don't want to use the word, but was invaded by the Muslims in the 10th century, because such words, again, seems to be anachronistic today. But Sicily was invaded in the 10th century by the Muslims, and you have, as a result of that, preponderant number of Muslims in that society. So much so that, you will have the introduction of, introduction of Arabic practices, Islamic practices in Sicily. Sicily would eventually be considered to be home of advancement consequent to this presence. And one of the major influences that we can pinpoint to as a result of this earliest presence is, in fact, the major innovations that were spearheaded by the person of Frederick II. Frederick II was an interesting figure for me in the sense that he was able to build a consistent partnership, relationship with the Arabs, with the Black people, with the Muslims in this territory. So much so that, some of the practices, in fact, studies have shown that Frederick II could actually speak Arabic, that he was very, very fluent in Arabic, consequent to this earliest partnership that he built with the Muslims in the territory. So four things are very, very important for us in this analysis, which is that firstly, it was during the reign of Frederick II that you have the first European systemic regulation of pharmacy. This is a practice that that can be dated back to Baghdad as far back as the 3rd century, which is that for the very first time, you would have the separation of pharmaceutical works from that of medical work. We are talking about the distinction between the work of a pharmacist and a physician. That would be the first time at which you would have that kind of systematic practices being recognized in Europe. Secondly, pharmaceutical practices required licensing. This became, a renowned practice as a result of the activities of Frederick II. Quality control of drugs, Arabic-derived tests were also translated in the court of Frederick II. Ultimately, I'm submitting on this note that this section establishes that European pharmacology was never insular. Rather, it was constituted through trans-regional intellectual exchange, providing the epistemic foundation for apothecary culture. I return to what I said earlier on, that when you imagine a pharmacy, you imagine a pharmacy today as a conventional place where you have chemical and like that. But there you have it. This is a pharmacist, a professional one for that matter, and he have his drugs right there, laid it out on the table. What are these drugs? Spicy, spicy. And during the medieval period or the late Middle Ages, spices essentially plays different roles. I mean, they could be used, they could be considered as food, they could be considered as, for perfume usage. They could also be considered for medicinal purposes. So spicy was indeed a big deal. And in fact, understand how, quote unquote, a big deal spicy was, we look at the etymology of the word spicy itself. And I'm pushing forward. Oh, no. It's a knowledge in the public domain. I'm postulating here that the word spicy is in a way relatable to the word special, although they have different roots, as I've pointed out here. But again, there seems to be an affinity. There seems to be a relationship between the word spicy and special, pointing again to the importance of this phenomenon. But why is spicy such a big deal in medieval Europe? It was such a big deal because the north temperature climate limited locally grown spicy in medieval Europe. So these spices are in natural fact, they have got to be imported into Europe, consequent to the climatic reality of that material point in time. I forge ahead. Before the proliferation of pharmacies, spices as markers of origin, distance, and class. Well, it is important to know that, as a basis, as an effect of how important spices were in medieval Europe, it became, a marker of origin, distance, and class. So spices then became, like a class commodity. You have got to be special in the society. You have got to be a member of the elite in order to have access to spicy. In fact, to have access to some spices such as saffron, you must be a wealthy person in medieval Europe. Saffron was not a spicy for every other person. And I think till this material point in time, the most important spice in Europe today is still saffron, in actual fact, which shows to which buttresses some of the points we're making here. What I've come to also uncover is that, as a way of also pushing this agenda that Black representation in European pharmaceutical displays are not really accidental, is that what I've come to understand is that major medieval source of spices actually were coming from territories heavily populated by Black people. Territories heavily populated by Black people. And I take you to the Book of Wonders, published in the 15th century. In the Book of Wonders published in the 15th century, you have the articulation of the expedition, the experiences, a narrative from Marco Polo. Marco Polo was an important, quote unquote, in quotes now, in a very, very big quote, was an important explorer, in the medieval period. So it was in this region, in what we would call Southeast part of India, modern India, to get pepper. And in his account on those he met, in his account on, those he saw, although he gave a very racialized, narrative, because it doesn't really matter if they were wearing the clothes you were wearing. They were comfortable in their own territory. So he gave a very demeaning, description of these persons. But they become important to me because what he said then, in a way, can be traced to the Kerala people of today, the Kerala people of India. Studies have shown that, in fact, Kerala seems to be an important pepper, farming territory till date. Therefore, affirming for grounding, Marco Polo's conclusion on where he got his pepper in the 14th century. Beyond this region, the spicy islands of Moluccas, Banda, the Indonesian region, as I would come to show. Important spices were also coming from this territory. Important spices were also coming from this territory during the medieval period. Needless do I need to mention the grains of paradise coming from West Africa and other territories. So the point being made with this particular juncture where we are is that it is not accidental. During the medieval period, spicy trade was ongoing, and then those territories where most of these spices were being gotten were actually territories populated by Black people. And luckily for me, I visited the Anesthetic Museum in Lübeck, and I saw this amazing, piece of evidence. And by the way, this is a Kerala pepper farmer, Black pepper farmer in southwestern, I said southeast earlier on, my apologies, southwestern India. And this is an image taken in 2019. And this evidence that I found at the Anesthetic Museum in Lübeck is very, very important for me, in the sense that it foregrounds the exact thing Marco Polo said in the 12th century. You could see where the Black pepper, the pepper itself, which was an important spicy during the medieval, you could see, where it was coming from, the region where it was coming from, where you have this particular spicy wars in medieval, and we are talking about 1350, 1350, the Book of Good Food. These are imports into Germany, during the 14th century. Salt was an important one. Next to salt was this pepper. And you can see, the region where it was coming from, for granting some of the positions we're making here as not being fallacious. Yeah. So we further here again with the etymology. I attempted to look at the etymology of myrrh, and I know Claudia was mentioning, well, we've got to be straight on some certain things. And I think it's important to foreground it that the word myrrh emanated firstly from, Latin description of, I know today we try to say that it was more of a geographical explanation, but it was very, very clear during this period that the word myrrh was certainly used for dark, the word dark complexion, because dark complexion was used as the basis for this. And in fact, you would see how this word in its transition would project similar meaning. For instance, in Greek, interpretation of it, you have myrrhus, which also means dark, ultimately, for me, I think three things are very, very important to analyze. That we have got to look at this etymology, because we have been told in some quarters that the word myrrh has always been a racialized word. I think that cannot be correct. Because, one of the things that we have got to do as historians, again, as following from what Joseph Miller told us, is that we must look at the changing dynamics at whatever period and different points in time. We must, treat issues within the context of their time, within the context of their period, and see how they move into different forms and into different changes. Not to give a blanket analysis, that the word myrrh is a racialized word. It has always been a racialized word. I really do not think that in itself, is progressive in any way. So we have got to use this etymological description to assert that the word more has not always been a racialized phenomenon. Indeed, eventually became racialized. And we're going to get to that point. Indeed, it eventually became racialized, but racialization did not begin its history. And from the earliest period, it was used in describing people of dark complexion. And you could see its variances across, Europe, Portuguese. We have different, variations of the word more, not just in Germany, in Portuguese language, Italian language, Macedonian. I have this, here as a way of projecting that idea to demonstrate that, this is not a word that can be restricted to just a country in Europe. It is a word that has all-encompassing background. And within the context of Germany, again, we have been told in some quarters that the word more became usable in Germany around the 19th century. I disagree with that analysis, because I've come to see that, as a matter of fact, the word more within German context, within German lexical context, goes back to the medieval period. And how do we see this? You can look at this from the 13th century. The popular German romance novel, Pavillats, yeah. And in this work, actually, which is very, very important again, you have this description, you have this, the author said this, and I translated it, the translation is in public domain. Black color as I am a more. Oh, that's not complete. I think it's something like, I am black, I'm of black color, and at the same time, I'm a more. What this is pointing out is very, very important. The duality of the origin, as at that time, of the word. Because, again, while I'm postulating that during the earliest time, the word more was used for dark people. During the medieval period, consequent to the arrival of the Arabs, the Jews, and what have you, in Europe, Christian medieval writers began to use the word to describe the entirety of Muslims. The entirety of Muslims, regardless of color. So that for you to see that we are talking about a phenomenon, we are talking about a word that has consistently been on a changing plane. It is not restricted, it is not static. It is not just a word that revolves within staticism. It is continuously projecting itself by changing its understanding and its narrative. So you can see this author, this interesting author, provides us with this analysis. And I attempted to look at how the word in itself, changed from time to time in Germany. I returned to Sicily, where I'm just going to explain, the presence of Black people in medieval Sicily. And you can see we have these two carved stone figures from the cloister capitals of Myrrh Cathedral in Sicily. Apparently, we're talking about two Black soldiers being represented in this imagery. And the first one is this should be a Christian medieval army. It should be a Black figure, as we have been told. Possibly a description of a crusade war going on. And we also have this. Ultimately, what we are suggesting by this description is that the presence of Black people in Sicily, in medieval Italy during this period was not mythical, that it was not mythical. We have seen that Black population in this territory, they participated in trade networks. They participated in military service, which is one thing that endeared this population to Frederick II. They were very, very active, in the corps, in the question of this military infantry. They were sometimes these full soldiers, what have you, building this asymmetrical relationship during this period. They also, had contributed to the labor system in this city, projecting what we call the urban economy. Buttressing the fact that, again, this presence was not mythical. And fortunately for us also, we have been able to come across, manuscripts that goes back to the 12th century, to the 11th century, where it has been said in the book of the Curiosity that actually in Palermo, there was indeed a gate. There were several gates in Palermo, but there was indeed a gate known as the Gate of the Blacks, Baba Sudan. And this is just another way of buttressing the fact that we are not discussing something mythical. We are not discussing something mythical here. We are discussing a phenomenon well grounded in history. And also let us also identify the fact that the last king of Bari is also an important medieval city in Italy. The last king of Bari has been said to be a black figure, a black person, in the person of Swadan. Sudan, as we know it of today, is a word in Arabic that means black. And I'm moving fastly now. So, so we have this Frederick II, in a way, as a way of appreciating this presence, because it wasn't what we have been told often is that this presence was subservient in a way. That this black population, if I thought they were there, they were servants, they were states. Well, while identifying that indeed the power rose, it is not to foreclose the part. It is not to foreclose the fact that there could be some, that the relationship could be asymmetrical. But it is important for us to also note that we are talking about individuals that possibly have their own independent social mobility. And that is why when you examine some of the imagery, some of the representation of black figures in this court, in this federal court, they were, representations that point to dignity. They weren't representations that point to subserviency. They weren't representations that were exaggerative, in a way. This is Jonas Morris, an important figure being depicted, in the court of Frederick as far back as the 13th century. And narrative have it that, as a matter of fact, he was made the administrator of a particular territory known as the Lucera colony. Just to understand the relationship Frederick II built with, the black population or the, Muslim population in Sicily. It was such that we are talking about a period where the Crusade War was ongoing, but Frederick refused to wage a war on the Muslims. Despite the pressure from the papacy, despite the pressure from the Pope, Frederick refused to wage a war. He was the only medieval king, perhaps, that did not wage a war against the Muslims. And when the pressure became so much, he resettled the Muslim population in Sicily to Lucera. And he actually made Jonas, an administrator of that population. There you have it, some sculptures of black people in Frederick II's court, also pointing to, interesting images that one cannot, because of its realism for me. The realism here is, these images, in a way, are different from what would become the norm eventually. The racialized, for instance, you cannot compare this imagery to the racialized symbols that would adorn the pharmacies in the 19th century. You cannot. We're talking about images of realism here. So these displays are called the Four Africans. In Apulia, Italy. More of this. And for me, this is the most interesting one again. Frederick II receiving homage from diverse groups, including Africans, Jews. This imagery is important because, again, Frederick II imagined himself as king of the world and whatever. And here is he, welcoming persons from different groups. Interestingly for us, or interestingly for me, is that different groups were depicted in their theories in this image. But the black persons, the black figures are depicted in four. They are the only ones depicted in four. You could tell this, maybe Jew, Muslims, but if only we could zoom it, you would see what I'm talking about. They are the only ones depicted in their fours. All other groups were depicted in threes. And again, this takes me back to the Gate of the Blacks in Palermo, because again, we have been told that Frederick II's court is actually not far away from Palermo. It's in fact situated at the heart of Palermo, pointing to the fact that, you can only describe a place as Gate of the Blacks if you have a preponderant number of these persons in that in that environment. So again, it is not mythical, what we are discussing. But in the post-Hohenstaufen, by the way, the dynasty of Frederick II is known as the Hohenstaufen dynasty. When Frederick II, died, I think the process of destruction of this representation became a name. It became a norm. And then the first thing that comes to mind here is the 14th century flag of Sardinia. The 14th century flag of Sardinia projects, 4 more heads. And the narrative, the legend that backs up this narrative is that, well, in the Battle of Aposa in 1096, 4, more kings were actually beheaded. And that as a result of being beheaded, the legend has it that, these 4 more Muslims, they were beheaded, and as a result of that, there's a way out which, the institutionalization of this legend as this representative, as a way to commemorate that crusade war. But what I've come to understand is that this is actually a deceptive, distorted representation that can actually be traced back to the 4 African heads that became the norm of Frederick II's court. And I'm saying this against the backdrop of the fact that when you look at the Royal Chancery Seal of Peter III de Hagen, what happened is that this king, this Spanish king, after the death of Frederick II, he took over Sicily. He became the king of Sicily. And he not only took over Sicily, he also incorporated the iconographies, the Black iconographies that were domiciled at this court. He took them over so that for the very first time, you would have this seal, displaying 4 African heads, in actual fact, as a way of commemorating or maintaining, the continuous practice that you can pinpoint here. And my argument is that, there's a way at which this practice, this seal became a norm, proliferated to the point at which it was eventually, incorporated into because legend. No consistent narrative. There is no source today that points to the beheading of 4 persons' heads, at the Battle of Alorza of 1096. Now moving fastly. So after that, you also have the emergence of the agonies, and you have these displays. It continues, but importantly, in the post-Hohenstaufen era, 3 things happened, which is the emergence of this Black symbolism in art, in heraldry, in commerce, and in these 3 places. You have them in the religious circle. I tried to look at the earliest German religious families, that incorporated this coat of arms. In the first one, the Kejebai is in 1263. In Freising, 1284. The Fulda families, the Voskel family in 1333. The Papian family in 14th century. This is how the incorporation began. The Taucher family of Lüneburg in 1345, they also incorporated this coat of arms. And amazingly, this German important medieval painter, Abachadoa, he was prominent so much so that, in fact, he was prominent in Italy more than he was in Germany because he spent a greater chunk of his artistic life in Italy. And then, amazingly or interestingly, he spent his artistic life in a city that has been described to be one of the earliest cities where you have a preponderant number of Black people, close to Palermo also. So what I did is to say in my argument that the emergence of modern apothecary understand, or M apothecary understood, eventually in Germany, can actually be traced back to Venice in Italy. That these practices were products of the presence of Arab spicy dealers, Jew spicy dealers, Black spicy dealers, who were collectively known as malls, in this territory. And then I tried to look at the earliest formation of these pharmacies. And, it goes back to the 15th century, Florence, where you have Farmacia de Moro. And then, if you look at the imperial road network of the medieval period, the imperial network that connected Italy to Germany, you would see that the emergence of this apotheker, was moving against the backdrop of that same, route, that trade route. The establishment of earliest apotheker in medieval Germany were responding, to this imperial road trade network that was in existence during this period. Earliest pharmacies in Italy, no need to do this. Because of time, I would like to point out that current Black representations are going on even in Italian pharmacies. Although again, the racialized discussion continues. This is Ferrucina de Moro. It is an herbal drink. It was produced again in 2016, but the owners of this pharmacy, they said that this production goes back to the 18th century by their forebearers, that they've been into the production of herbal medicine, that they learned this in Sicily, during the medieval period. I don't want to go into the explanation of the Gobelin, but some other time we could do that. Then you have also the Farmacia de Moro, established in 1521, still in existence. Of course, I mentioned it in Florence. So the argument basically is that Venice is very, very important in we understanding how pharmaceutical culture and the representation of Black persons, Black iconographies became a norm in medieval Germany. And then you can also understand this when you examine the fact that in actual fact during the medieval period, there was indeed a German warehouse, in Italy. There was indeed known as the Fadaco de Tachisi, there was, during the, and merchants from Nuremberg, Augsburg, Cologne, Asiatic have been said to be, major, owners of these warehouses. So I would like to conclude by saying that these representations, this whole thing, in a way, continues. In the sense that the role representation plays, I've been able to foreground that this whole discussion, debate, contentious, discussion around apotheker is more about the visual representation than the semantics. That visualization is more important. I mean, in a way, what you see controls what you think. And, I come from Yoruba land in Nigeria, and we have this proverb that Omojuri Enuoleso, what the eye sees, sometimes, the mouth cannot speak. What that means is that the eye is powerful. So what the eye sees, in a way, forms the basis of our understanding. And my argument is that from the 18th century to the 19th century, the iconographies that accompanies apotheker in Germany were essentially racialized, were primitive, were imageries of quote unquote caricature Black people, therefore becoming the basis of people understanding this. So people do not really pay attention to the historical narrative because of the existence of this racialized visualization. And my argument here is that these racialized visualizations in a way still continue because again, we must understand, the intersection, the relationship between visual representation and semantics and words in themselves. And, you cannot walk one city to the other in Germany, for an instance, without coming across a billboard or a short billboard of, NGO asking for money, to save some children in Africa, that do not have access to. I'm arguing that this is a representation that needs to be gotten rid of, because it is again, one of those representations that if you properly understand, are representations that are not getting, human society to anywhere, because they are representations. Representations are very, very powerful. Representations are not independent. Representations, they shape mindsets. They shape our understanding of realities. You know, and that's why I'm arguing that such representations today have become anachronistic. And unfortunately, in 2015, in 2025 in Lüneburg, I observed that also. The community tried to dispute the three magi. But the description of the black figure is something I will never accept, because aside from its ugliness, it's just that it doesn't speak anything. You know, which foregrounds the argument that I'm making, that representation is very, very challenging. Thank you.